Hello everyone. The topic of our discussion today is trade, production pattern and global inequality or world inequality. The whole lecture will be actually covered in 3 different sessions. The learning objective and the structure of the presentation is on your screen. As you can see, we have basically 3 segments of our presentation today. In the first segment, we discuss the importance of trade, why trade matters. In the second segment, we give you some idea of the trends in inequality and so on. And in the third segment, we kind of bring them together, give you some overview of how these two can be connected from various theoretical positions. Now, let's start with the first segment, why trade matters. The moment we think of international trade, we can't think of this topic without reference to people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Both of them actually made a very simple argument that if a country is good at producing something, which means if a country can produce something at a relatively cheaper rate, it should focus on production of it, meaning it should specialize on it and export. And import commodities which they are not very good at producing. Now that's the simplest argument in favor of free trade. You need to understand that Smith and Ricardo were kind of promoting free trade in a very different context where trade was heavily protected. Now, what are the some of the basic arguments in favor of free trade? Of course, free trade leads to expansion of market, therefore boosts aggregate demand, helps to promote industrialization, improve the level of employment and economic growth, therefore, as a whole. Now, with free trade, you also have technology transfer from advanced countries to not so technologically advanced countries, like from developed to developing countries or underdeveloped countries. You also have the provision or potential for capital flow, in the sense you have foreign direct investment, for example. Now, there's another thing, what free trade also does. It also improves the competitiveness, which then also improves the level of efficiency in the economy. Now, it goes without saying that international trade broadens the options for both consumers as well as producers. Now, all these points we have said basically are the points why international trade is good as far as economic growth is concerned. First thing we need to remember that all these are points which are argued that this could happen if you have free trade. But in reality, none of these things are actually guaranteed. There's no guarantee that these would happen. It may or may not. But the second thing that which we are actually concerned today is about the idea that what are the impact or consequences of international free trade for economic inequality. Now that is something we'll be discussing as we go along. Okay. Let's just give you an overview of the international trade. The first graph, as you can see here, it shows you the trade openness. Here we have provided some sort of index which is called trade openness index. And as you can see, on the x-axis we have plotted the years, and on the y-axis we have plotted the trade openness index. Now, what is the trade openness index? It is basically the export plus imports divided by global GDP. So how relevant overall international trade is to world GDP. Now, as it increases or decreases, it shows that whether trade openness is increasing or decreasing. Except a very specific phase in the history, as you can see, let's say the period of early 20th century. But you all generally have a rising trend in the index, especially in the later half of 20th century, indicating the fact that the trade openness has actually increased over the years, except a very specific phase in history. This next graph that you can see on your screen actually corroborates the argument we are making just now. It is actually a graph of growth of global exports, but we should read it in the following way. We are taking the year 1913 as our reference point. So, for example, in 1890, the overall world export may be 90% or 80% of the global export of the year 1913. Similarly, what we see, what is the level of export today, or let's say in the early 2000s, as compared to the year of 1913. Let me give you some reading of this graph, for example. So let's say we are thinking about the year 2013. As per this graph, the volume of global exports is found to be about 40 to 45 times of the same which was in 1913. In other words, if we value, if we take the value of global exports, which was in 1913, if we take that as $100, in 2013 it would be roughly about $4,000 to $4,500. Now, compared to the 20th century, the previous century looks very, not so good, but that's not true. If we zoom in and look at what was happening in, let's say, 19th century, over the 19th century, we see even then it was growing, export was growing, but of course, not as rapidly as we have seen the growth in the 20th century, more specifically in the later half of 20th century. For example, if you actually considered the 19th century, we see that it took about, a whole century, 100 years or so, from the growth index to reach from 0% to 100%. But in the next 100 years, it actually went up from 100% to more than 4,000%. Of course, a very obvious question, interests us here. All these, boom in exports and all, did it help the countries in terms of achieving higher economic growth? Something that we were discussing earlier, right? Let's look at this scatter plot. What are we plotting on the x-axis here? We have average annual change in GDP per capita on the x-axis, and we have average annual change in merchandise exports as a share of GDP on the y-axis. This is a scatter plot of various countries covering the period 1945 to 2016. It tells us that on an average, the trend is following. The countries with relatively higher per capita growth also happens to be the countries, which have higher share of merchandise exports as a percentage of their GDP, right? So it is kind of indicative of the positive correlation. It shows a positive correlation between these two variables. But mind you, that does not per se mean causation, right? Now, one other important point of this graph is that the color of the points actually indicate the continents, right? Now, what we see here, most of the countries which seem to have really benefited from this kind of relationship are the Asian countries, where South Korea really looks like a outlier in the whole story. Okay, now here is a question for you. By and large, do you think whether there is a negative or positive correlation? What do you think? Is there a negative or positive correlation between export growth and income growth? Think about it. So we gave you a question, which is, by and large, do you think is there a negative or positive correlation between export growth and income growth? Well, as far as the previous scatter plot is concerned, it is indicative of the fact that there could be some sort of positive correlation between the rising importance of merchandise export as a share of GDP and the growth in GDP per capita. Okay, so that was our segment 1, where we covered basically why trade is important and the increasing estimates about the global trade and etc. The next segment, we basically cover the topic of inequality, and this is a very important topic in global economy today. And in this particular segment, we'll not get into the deeper theoretical or technical analysis of inequality. Rather, we shall focus on some of the evidences we have regarding the trends in inequality and so on, right? Okay. So let's focus on that. First, what you see on your slide here on the screen, we are presenting the income gap between countries, right? So the global inequality can be thought of in the following way: that what is the income gap between different countries, the gap in per capita income between different countries. Now, what we are presenting here is the ratio of GDP per capita in developing countries or in other regions of the world to that of the developed countries. So it's a simple math. You take the per capita GDP of developing countries divided with the per capita GDP of the developed countries. Now, if this ratio is going up, good news for developing countries, implying that the income gap between developing countries and developed countries is actually reducing. If that ratio falls, it implies that the gap between these two kinds of countries is actually rising. So what you have here, now in this case, what we can clearly see, for example, let's focus on the graph, that firstly for Latin American countries, there is some sort of a cyclical pattern, long run cyclical pattern, which is not the case for the other developing countries as a whole, or even Asian countries for that matter. Secondly, if you look at the Asian countries trend, right? I think the sky color line will be the Asian countries in the graph. Now, what do we see here? There is a steady and considerable increase in this ratio, which basically implies that the gap between the GDP per capita of the Asian countries and that of the developed countries is actually falling, which is good news for Asia, right? But that is not the case, unfortunately, with the African countries. That line is kind of steady with very little upward trend, almost negligible in the long run if you see. So this graph therefore tells us that the dynamics of income inequality seen from the perspective of income gap between different countries is a very complicated thing. There are spatial variations, there are temporal variations. Okay, let's move on to the topic of global inequality seen from the following perspective. Let us think now that we are considering all the people of the world like in one country or one nation or one economic entity for that matter. Okay, the whole globe is our one economy. All the people of globe is like one economy's people, like population of a country. Like a population of a country, we are considering the population of the whole world here, right? So what we're doing here, once we have all the people of the world, now we identify the richest 1% and we also identify different wealth brackets here, right? We also identify the richest 0.1% of the population. We identify the bottom 50% of the population as far as the income is considered. Again, for the world wealth distribution, we do something of a similar thing, like we identify different ranges of wealth. Okay, what do we see here? Let's focus on the left side panel. Clearly, as expected, the top 1% has a much larger claim in the entire income compared to the bottom 50%. And for most of the last 3 to 4 decades, this share has steadily increased, as you can see. The pattern in the movement of this particular share is somewhat similar in case of the top 0.1% as well. Only since the mid to late 2000s, the income share of the richest income classes have reduced a little bit. Well, this was the income inequality. Once you focus on the wealth inequality, the situation is really, really scary. Now look at the global wealth distribution. The global wealth inequality is at an unacceptably high level, right? Now the seriousness of the matter can be easily understood if you actually compare the population share of various wealth class and their share in the total wealth. Now you can see that those people who own actually wealth under 10,000 USD are more than 50% of the world population with a wealth share of less than 1%. Implying very simple thing. Those people who are like 50% of the population, more than 50% of the population, holds less than 1% of the total global wealth. Compare this with the other class, the top, wealthiest class. What do you see there? They have the largest wealth share, something like 45% of the global wealth is owned by about 1% of the people in the world. Now, this kind of inequality is very high. Okay. Now let's look at 3 different countries, USA, China and India. Okay, we're now going to focus on within country inequality numbers. Now here also what we see that the gap between the upper income bracket and the lower income bracket, the gap between the upper income bracket and the middle income bracket, that gap is actually rising. Now if we divide the households into different categories, as I just mentioned, lower, middle and upper, you can see that trend is very clear. This is true for both income as well as wealth. So in United States also you have the evidence of rising inequality. Remember, we have just moved from global inequality to within country inequality. Let's look at the inequality in China. All the kinds of numbers I am presenting on these slides indicate one simple thing. Inequality in China is actually rising, except very recently there is some sort of downward trend which you can see on the top left panel here, Gini coefficient of income inequality. The trend from 1981 to 2014, there's a little bit of decrease in the recent past. Otherwise, the inequality is actually rising. This sort of situation also vanishes once you look at it from the perspective of the income share of the top 1% or let's say the bottom 50%. Look at the income share of the top 1% or top 10% in China. That is actually rising rapidly, right? If you compare China with other countries or other regions of the world, both in terms of the level of inequality and in terms of the change in inequality since early 90s, China has actually topped the list. So China is one of the countries in the world with some fastest growth and a very fast growth in export, right? But it is also one of the countries in the world which is most unequal as of now, as you can see here, right? You can see both on the right side, both the graphs, the level of inequality and also the change in the level of inequality Along both the axes, China is actually more unequal than many other parts of the world. Okay, let's come to the Indian story. What we present here is the share of national income that is going to the top 1% in India, and on the right side we are presenting the share of top 0.1%. So what do we see here? We see that since independence, that trend is actually diminishing, meaning the inequality is decreasing since independence. Unfortunately, there is a reversal since 1980s and more, 1990s onwards. Unfortunately, we have come to a situation where the inequality seen from this perspective, that the income share of the top 1% or the income share of the top 0.1%, we have gone back to what was the situation in colonial period. So basically what we have achieved in the first 30 years of independence, somehow we kind of lost it in the next 30 years or next 40 years of independence. So that is the scenario of inequality in India. India is also one of the countries in the world with a very high growth, long-term growth, and also its trade growth is also very high. Export growth is also has improved over the years. Okay, now there's a question for you. Do you think over the last 3 to 4 decades, inequality increased only in the developing countries and not in the developed countries? So we gave you a question. What do you think? The inequality in the last 3 to 4 decades have increased. It has increased only in the developing countries and not in the developed countries? Well, if you go back to the graphs we just presented, and if you further dig into this particular thing, there are a lot of websites where you can get the data. You actually see that the rising inequality trend is true for across countries, be it a developed country like United States of America or be it countries like India and China. It's true for many countries in the world today that inequality has been rising rapidly. Fine. So what we have presented so far in the previous 2 segments, we have told you about the importance of trade and we have presented some numbers regarding the trends in inequality. Now we are going to the last segment of our presentation today, which is the trade, production pattern and inequality. What could be the possible link between these 3? Now, we discussed that trade is important and we have also presented some numbers in terms of the rising trade openness. We have also presented numbers regarding export growth, and we have also shown some numbers regarding the merchandise exports and the correlation between merchandise export and GDP per capita growth and so on. But more than growth, more than trade rather, it is the composition of the trade or the pattern of the trade that is more important. Be it in terms of what is the thing that country is trading into, like exporting what kind of things, importing what kind of things, and also the trading partnership. Is the trade happening between high-income countries? Is the trade happening between the low-income countries? Is the flow of export and import is from rich to non-rich or non-rich to rich? So if you actually see, we have therefore given you 2 kinds of things on the screen. As you can see, there is trade and production pattern, and there is flow of goods and services in terms of trading partners. So you can have manufacturing versus services. You can have, as far as the production pattern or the trade composition is concerned, you can have primary commodities versus vis-a-vis manufacturing goods. You can also have financial versus non-financial trades. As far as the trading partner is concerned, you can have the flow from rich to rich, rich to non-rich, non-rich to non-rich, and then also non-rich to rich, right? So these things will be important in more detail in our next session and the next presentation actually. So please remember that the production pattern and the trading pattern would be very important in our upcoming discussions. What you see on the screen is more about the flow between which countries, like the non-rich to rich on the right side, for example, non-rich to rich, non-rich to non-rich, rich to non-rich, and rich to rich. And if you take the distribution of global merchandise exports, what is the region of origin? From which country you are getting how much, what percentage of global export, right? So for example, just look at the left side of left panel graph, right? So what we present here is the distribution of global merchandise export by region of origin. From which region you may get how much of the total merchandise export. Now we see that the relevance of low-income countries has reduced over time. You can clearly see that it is marked that the topmost part of the graph is low-income countries, and the share of upper middle-income countries has risen for some time, with somewhat little bit of decrease in the recent past. The opposite trend holds true for the high-income countries. If you actually see on the right panel, right, you see the graph on the right panel actually tells us, the flow as I mentioned. Now, This particular graph we are not explaining here because we want you to think about this graph and explore different interpretations, reading of this graph. Remember one thing, in all our presentation we are using a lot of graphs. We may highlight some of the things, but that is not an exhaustive list. You would also have to dig deeper and find out different interpretations of the graphs we are presenting here. Okay, now we have mentioned about inequality, and let's now give an overview of how can we perceive inequality from different perspectives. Because remember, the topic we are discussing is the relationship between trade, production pattern, and inequality. We just discussed that the trade pattern in terms of what kind of commodities we are trading, in terms of who are the trading partners, and now we are getting into looking into the inequality aspect from various perspectives. So on the left side, we are segregating these perspectives on the basis of unit of analysis. On the right side, you see inequality of what? So what is the factor, which variable we are concerned about, right? So let's discuss each of them carefully. Now, if we think of the inequality and global inequality as a whole, as we just presented also the inequality numbers, you can take the whole globe as a whole and think of interpersonal inequality. You can also, look at the whole world in the sense that you can think of inter-country inequality, you can think of intra-country inequality. As far as the inter-country inequality is concerned, you can actually look into the gap between or the inequality between developed countries versus developing countries or underdeveloped countries, or what will be very important in our discussions, we can also think of the developed and developing countries in the sense that core countries and the peripheral countries. When I use the word core countries or the countries in the economic core in the world, it generally refers to the developed parts of the world. And when we say the periphery, it's generally referring to the developing and underdeveloped, less developed countries of the world. So you can think of the inter-country inequality in this way, developed versus developing, core versus periphery. As far as the intra-country inequality is concerned, even there you can think of interpersonal inequality, then you can think of intergroup inequality, you can also think of spatial inequality. What do we mean by intergroup inequality? A society can be thought of divided into various groups, from the class angle, from the caste angle, from the gender angle, from the racial angle. So accordingly, you may have class inequality, caste inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality. And you can also actually decompose, technically speaking, the entire inequality into intergroup and intragroup inequality. When it comes to spatial inequality, okay, you can think of interstate inequality, you can think of rural-urban inequality, you can think of inter-regional inequality. Now, why did we mention all these aspects? Because the word inequality per se does not mean anything. There are various measures of inequality and there are various ways to think about inequality, which unit of analysis we are taking. And this we mentioned because in the upcoming discussion, we shall focus on inter-country inequality, that is the gap between countries, and we shall also focus later in the third discussion in this whole topic, where we shall focus on the relationship between trade and within country inequality. Then we move on to inequality of what? You can think of inequality of outcome, you can think of inequality of opportunities. As far as the inequality of outcome is concerned, you can focus on income inequality, you can focus on wealth inequality. As far as income inequality is concerned, you can be more specific. Are we talking about wage income inequality? Are we talking about inequality of property income, the income that you generate out of different assets and property? So, these things need to be made very clear when we think about the issues at hand. Okay, now a question for you. What are the various ways that we can perceive inequality? So we gave you a question. What are the various ways to perceive and analyze inequality? Which you can actually find out the answer from the previous slide, where we have discussed that you can think of interpersonal inequality, you can think of inter-country inequality, intra-country inequality. In case of intra-country inequality, you can think of group inequality, right? Like caste inequality, class inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality, and so on. And you can also think of the inequality in terms of inequality of what? Is it wealth inequality? Is it income inequality? What is it that we are concerned about? Okay, so we have come to almost the last part of our discussion today, where we kind of bring these things together, the how trade and inequality could be connected. Now, this is very, very important to understand that as far as free trade is concerned, there are broadly, four strands or four ideological positions, so to speak, or theoretical positions, so to speak. The first group actually supports is on the leftmost on the screen, as you can see, that free trade is undoubtedly beneficial for all. And they would cite the reasons that we had started our presentation with. Initially, we mentioned some of the reasons that why free trade is good. So they would say that if developing countries, underdeveloped countries, less developed countries, they open up their economy, they get into free trade, liberalize their economy, it would really benefit them, and it would help to reduce the gap of income, or rather inter-country inequality, the income gap between different parts of the world. So that is their argument. So they would say there could be potentially a convergence between different countries that we're talking about. So through free trade, these countries will have productivity gain and income growth and so on, and they'll have perhaps globally we'll see some sort of convergence, between countries. Again, second group is in contrast to the first one. The second group says that free trade is undoubtedly not beneficial for all. Now they would highlight that first of all, the gain of trade, the gain from trade, is not equally distributed between countries or people within the same country. So they're not saying that there will be no gain from the trade per se. They would say that if there is a free trade, there will be some sort of economic gain. The point is who would get what percentage of the gain. So this is the group that actually focusing on the distributional aspect. They're saying the gain from the trade is not so, it's not very simply distributed equally or similarly between different countries. So we shall get into that in the next session, where we shall highlight that the gain from the trade can be unequally distributed, or rather through free trade there could be an increasing divergence between countries. Again, within the same country, free trade might lead to rising inequality. Some groups may benefit more relatively compared to the other groups in the society. So there could be divergence between countries, there could be divergence within countries, right? There's the third group. The third group argues that the impact of free trade as far as growth, distribution, these matters are concerned is not very straightforward. It's very ambiguous. All kinds of evidence are very mixed in nature and etc. However, they would argue that you need to have good industrial policy. That would be very important as far as benefiting from the trade is concerned. So you may open up your country, but how much you're really benefiting from trade would depend on the careful intervention by the government, making industrial policy properly, and all that. They also argue about timely intervention and appropriate intervention by the government at the time of crisis. One point, the second group actually might argue that the international trade might also increase volatility and loss of income, which the third group would say that timely measure by the government can actually help. The fourth group is a very interesting group. It is actually saying that free trade as an idea is a myth. You have never had free trade, and you will never have free trade. Historically speaking, think about the colonial era. It was anything but free trade. What this group is arguing, that today's developed countries are following policies, or rather, they are suggesting policies which they themselves have not followed. We have mentioned some of these books, related books on the screen you can see. Now the last part, we summarize and talk about the road ahead. We discussed about the importance of trade. We discussed about the various findings of inequality we have. And also we talked about the potential links between these two various theoretical positions in this matter. The next discussion, we shall focus on the link between international trade production pattern and inequality between countries. And the session after that, we shall go into inequality within countries. Thank you.